MIT's top minds gave up. Then, in the quiet of midnight, the janitor raised his hand. The hallways of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology always carried a hum. By day, it was a restless music, students rushing with coffee cups, professors clutching folders stuffed with equations, the clatter of keyboards, the rhythm of ambition. But by night, when the last lecture had ended and the last seminar door was locked, a different sound claimed the corridors. The faint scrape of a mop against tile, the gentle rattle of keys at a janitor's belt, and the slow, steady breathing of a man who knew the building better than most of the minds inside it. His name was Samuel Ortiz. 60 years old, shoulders bent from decades of work, hands strong from hauling more buckets than books. To most who passed him in daylight, he was invisible. Just the janitor with the tired smile, always there, always sweeping. Few knew that he had been sweeping these halls for 20 years, since his wife's illness forced him to trade dreams of teaching for a job that kept food steady on the table. Samuel's world was simple. A thermos of black coffee, a cart of supplies, and the company of chalk dust left behind after brilliant minds had gone home. Some nights, when the lecture rooms were empty and the air still smelled faintly of ink and paper, he would linger at the edge of a blackboard, reading the ghostly marks not yet erased. He could not always follow the details, but he listened. He listened the way a farmer listens to the weather, catching the rhythms, sensing the shape of a storm without knowing the science of clouds. On this night, the chalkboard in room 4149 was crowded with numbers and symbols. Lines of prime numbers marched across the surface, some circled, some connected by arrows that bent like vines. At the bottom, in neat block letters, a sentence remained. No proof known. Conjecture remains open. Samuel set down his mop and leaned closer. Twin primes. He had seen the phrase before. He remembered hearing a professor describe it one afternoon, his voice echoing in the hallway. Do infinitely many prime numbers come in pairs, like 11 and 13, 17 and 19, always two apart? No one knows. Not yet. Samuel traced the chalk lines with his eyes. He thought of pairs. His wife Maria, gone now 10 years, but still walking with him in memory. His daughter Elena, who called every Sunday from Chicago, always asking if he was eating well. Pairs were not just numbers. They were lives. They were the proof that no one should walk too long in solitude. He picked up the eraser, then paused. The problem on the board looked unfinished, like a melody cut off before its final note. He searched his pocket for the stub of a pencil he sometimes carried, the one he used to jot shopping lists. He found it, along with a folded receipt from the corner store. Carefully, he began to copy a few of the numbers. His handwriting was shaky, but the rhythm steadied him. As he wrote, he remembered evenings long ago when he and Maria sat at the kitchen table, helping Elena with homework. Maria would laugh, tapping Samuel's hand whenever he solved a fraction before their daughter could. "You were born for chalk," she used to say. Samuel never argued. He only smiled, because he knew life demanded more than chalk. Life demanded rent and medicine, night shifts and quiet sacrifice. But here, at midnight in an empty classroom, chalk seemed to call him back. The corridor outside was silent. Only the ticking of the old clock near the doorway kept time. Samuel looked again at the chain of numbers. 11 and 13, 17 and 19, 29 and 31. Pairs holding hands across infinity. He whispered softly, as if to Maria, "They are like us, always close, always walking together." He did not imagine himself solving the problem. That was for the mathematicians, the professors with titles and grants. But something stirred inside him. an intuition born not from textbooks, but from years of noticing patterns in ordinary life. He had cleaned enough rooms to know which ones filled with chatter and which stayed empty. He had counted enough windows to know that odd ones always caught the morning light just so. Patterns were everywhere, waiting to be seen. Samuel tucked the receipt into his pocket and returned to his mop, yet the thought did not leave him. As he worked down the hallway, he began to murmur a rhythm. Prime, prime, then a space, then another prime. His steps matched the beat. When he reached the end of the hall, he chuckled quietly to himself. For the first time in years, he felt like a student again. At dawn, students would return to room 40149. They would erase the board, start fresh with new equations, new conjectures. Samuel knew his notes on the receipt would look like nothing to them. But to him, it was a spark. Not a solution, but a whisper that maybe, just maybe, even in the quiet of a janitor's life, there was room for infinity. That night, as he wheeled his cart back to the supply closet, Samuel paused by the tall windows. The city beyond was still dark, only the Charles River glinting faintly under the street lamps. He took the receipt from his pocket and looked at it once more. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside the worn leather cover of his small Bible, where he kept notes of things worth remembering. He whispered again, this time not to Maria but to himself. What if there are always more pairs? What if they never end? The clock struck 1. The corridor fell silent again. But inside Samuel, something had begun that silence could not erase. Morning at MIT came like a storm. Doors swung open, shoes clicked fast against the floors, conversations spilled from every hallway. What Samuel had left behind in room 4149, chalk dust, rows of primes, and his quiet thoughts folded on a grocery receipt, now stood under the bright eyes of students who had slept little, fueled by caffeine and competition. 3 of them entered first, their laughter easy, their backpacks heavy. They were graduate students, brilliant by reputation, impatient by nature. The chalkboard still bore the marks from the night before. One of them, a tall boy with a sharp jaw, read the bottom line aloud. Twin primes conjecture. No proof known. He smirked. Classic. Another, shorter, with glasses sliding down his nose, noticed something on the ledge beneath the board. A scrap of receipt paper, folded twice. He picked it up, unfolded it, and frowned. Lines of shaky handwriting filled the space. Numbers in pairs, little arrows connecting them. In the corner, a note written in hesitant letters. They never stop walking together. What's this? The boy with glasses said. The tall one leaned over, squinted, then burst out laughing. Looks like someone's grandfather got lost in Numberland. He snatched the paper, waved it in the air. Imagine this, MIT's big open problem solved on a grocery receipt. Their laughter filled the room. A third student, quieter than the others, tried to smile but glanced again at the paper. Something about it, rough as it was, carried a rhythm. He didn't understand it, but he didn't dismiss it either. Before he could speak, the tall boy crumpled the receipt and tossed it toward the trash can. It missed, landing near the corner of the desk. That was where Professor Elaine Harrow found it later that morning. Professor Harrow had taught number theory for 25 years. She was respected, feared a little, and known for her relentless precision. Her eyes missed nothing. When she entered room 4-149 to prepare for lecture, she saw the chalkboard, sighed, and began clearing space. Then she noticed the crumpled paper on the floor. She picked it up, smoothed it gently, and paused. Numbers, written unevenly, but in a sequence that hinted at intent. 11 and 13, 17 and 19, 29 and 31. A trail of pairs marching down the page. At the bottom, the note. They never stop walking together. It was not mathematics. Not in the rigorous sense. It was poetry leaning toward mathematics. Yet Harrow's brow furrowed. Many had dismissed this problem with shrugs or shrill laughter. But here was a janitor's hand. She recognized the uneven script. She had seen Samuel pushing his cart through these halls for years. She set the paper on the desk. For a long moment, she stood still, remembering her own childhood in Kansas, counting stars with her father on a farm porch. He had told her once, "Patterns are just stories the universe is waiting to tell." Maybe Samuel, without proof or formal training, had glimpsed the story behind the primes. When the students returned for class, she began her lecture without mentioning the note. But inside, something stirred. That evening, Samuel arrived again with his mop and bucket. As he entered room 4149, he noticed the board was clean. His eyes dropped to the desk. The receipt was gone. For a moment, he felt a pinch of disappointment, like a candle snuffed out. He turned to his work, pushing the mop slowly across the floor. "Mr. Ortiz," a voice called from the doorway. He looked up. Professor Harrow stood there, her blazer neat, her glasses catching the light. Samuel straightened. "Good evening, ma'am." She stepped inside, holding something in her hand. The receipt, now flattened and uncrumpled. She placed it on the desk. "Is this yours?" Samuel hesitated. "Just some scribbles. Nothing important." Her gaze softened. Important is not always measured by proof, sometimes by intention. He looked down, embarrassed. "I only wrote what I felt. Those numbers, they seem like friends who never want to part." The professor smiled faintly. "You know, that is not far from how many of us describe it. Two primes, bound by a distance of 2, walking side by side. No one knows if the path goes on forever." Samuel lowered his eyes. "I am no mathematician. Perhaps not by title," she replied. "But you saw something that many forget, that numbers are not just symbols, they are companions. You gave them life." He said nothing. The silence was heavy, yet not uncomfortable. Then she added, "If you ever wish to talk, room 3112 is my office. I keep the door open late." With that, she left, her heels clicking down the hall. Samuel stood there, the receipt between his fingers. He had expected ridicule. He had heard the laughter earlier when the students mocked the paper. But now, for the first time, someone had spoken to him as if his thoughts mattered. He folded the paper once more, slipped it back into his pocket, and continued his work. But the mop moved slower now, each stroke thoughtful. The building no longer felt like a place of only other people's brilliance. A door had opened, if only slightly. Later that night, as he left the campus, the city lights glowed along the river. Samuel paused at the edge of the bridge, the cool air brushing his face. He whispered almost to himself, "They never stop walking together. Maybe neither should I." The wind carried his words away, but inside him a quiet flame burned brighter. What had begun as a scribble on a receipt was no longer just his own secret. Someone else had seen it. Someone else had listened. And that was enough to keep him walking. The following week, the corridors of MIT felt heavier to Samuel. He still moved through them with his mop and his bucket, but now there was a new weight in the air, something between curiosity and suspicion. He had not told anyone about the receipt, yet whispers seemed to trail him. Students who once brushed past without a glance now looked twice. Some smiled faintly, others smirked, as if in on a private joke. In the cafeteria, a pair of graduate students spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "Did you see it? The janitor's little proof on grocery paper." Laughter followed, quick and sharp. Samuel lowered his eyes, carried his tray to a corner table, and ate in silence. By Thursday, the laughter reached a classroom. Professor Harrow had invited him quietly to sit in the back of her seminar on prime distributions. "Just listen," she said. No one will mind." Samuel hesitated but agreed. That afternoon he walked in late, dust still on his boots, uniform shirt pressed as best he could. Heads turned as he took a seat in the far corner. At the front, Harrow began her lecture, chalk in hand, her voice steady. She drew lines of numbers on the board, spoke of gaps between primes, of conjectures older than the students themselves. Samuel followed as best he could, catching fragments the way a farmer catches signs of rain. But midway through, a student raised his hand. Tall, confident, with the same sharp jaw Samuel remembered from the laughter in room 4149. His name was Daniel Lang. "Professor," Daniel said smoothly, "before we move on, may I ask something?" Harrow nodded. "Go ahead." Daniel glanced toward the back where Samuel sat. "I heard we have unusual contributions to the twin prime problem. Scribbled on grocery receipts, no less." His tone dripped with amusement. The room chuckled. Samuel's face burned. He shifted in his seat, hands folded tight. Professor Harrow's chalk paused against the board. "Mathematics," she said evenly, "is not measured by the paper it's written on, but by the thought it carries. Do you have a question relevant to today's discussion, Mr. Lang?" Daniel smiled thinly. "Yes, Professor. Since we are speaking of twin primes, perhaps our guest," he gestured toward Samuel, "would enlighten us. After all, he seems to have fresh insight. Do the primes walk forever, Mr. Ortiz?" The room erupted with soft laughter. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. Samuel stared at the floor. His throat tightened. He had no theorem, no formal language, nothing to defend himself with. But then he heard Maria's voice in memory, gentle as the kitchen lamp on a winter evening. "You were born for chalk." He lifted his eyes. Slowly, he stood. "I do not know proofs," Samuel said quietly. The laughter hushed, surprised by his voice. "But I know patterns. I have cleaned these halls for 20 years. Some doors open every day, some never. Some lights burn out after one night, others last for months. And I have learned that what looks random often hides a rhythm." He walked slowly to the chalkboard. Harrow stepped aside. With trembling fingers, Samuel picked up a piece of chalk. "These primes," he said, pointing to the numbers, "they are like workers on night shift, alone, yes, each one standing apart. But sometimes two walk together, 11 and 13, 17 and 19, like friends on the same road home. I do not know if it happens forever, but I believe the road is long enough for more than we can count." He drew two small circles side by side and connected them with a line, then another pair, then another. The board filled with tiny companions. The room was silent. No one laughed. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading. One student in the second row whispered, "That's actually beautiful." Samuel set the chalk down, stepped back. "I cannot solve your equations," he said softly, "but I see their heartbeat, and it tells me they are not alone." For a moment, only the hum of the overhead lights filled the room. Then Professor Harrow spoke, her voice low but firm. "Thank you, Mr. Ortiz. That was more insight than mockery ever gave us." Samuel nodded, returned to his seat. His hands shook, but his chest felt lighter. The lecture continued, though the air had changed. Students leaned forward, pens quieter, eyes softer. The laughter had broken, replaced by something Samuel had not expected: respect. After class, as the students filed out, one lingered. A young woman with notebooks pressed to her chest approached Samuel. "Mr. Ortiz," she said shyly, "the way you described it, primes like workers on night shift, I'll never forget that. Samuel smiled, weary but warm. It is only the way I understand it. She shook her head. Sometimes that's the best way. When he walked the halls that evening with his mop, Samuel felt the stares again. But they were different now. Not ridicule, not entirely. Some held curiosity, others quiet admiration. He kept moving, steady as always, but inside him a door had opened wider. Later, as he locked away his cart, he whispered to himself, "They walk together, and maybe so do I." The night air outside was crisp. The Charles River shone like a sheet of dark glass. Samuel crossed the bridge slowly, the city lights scattering across the water. For the first time in years, he did not feel invisible. He felt like a man carrying something small, yet real. A pattern, a heartbeat, a story of numbers that belonged not just to mathematicians, but to anyone who had ever walked a long road in the dark, hoping not to be alone. The invitation came not on paper, but in a voice. "Mr. Ortiz," Professor Harrow said one evening, finding him in the corridor with his mop. "Tomorrow we're holding a small seminar. Just faculty and a few graduate students. I'd like you to come, not to clean, to listen." Samuel straightened, uncertain. "Me? In a seminar?" She nodded. "Yes. Bring nothing but yourself." That night, Samuel could not sleep. He lay on the narrow bed in his modest apartment, the city's faint hum pressing against the windows. The old Bible rested on his nightstand, the folded grocery receipt tucked inside. He opened it, looked again at the pairs he had written, and whispered, "What am I doing, Maria? I am just a janitor." Yet he remembered her words from long ago. "You were born for chalk." The next morning he dressed carefully. A clean shirt, polished shoes, the scent of soap sharp in the air. He arrived at room 3-112 early, heart pounding. Inside, the seminar had already gathered. 10 people sat around a long table, professors with lined faces, graduate students clutching notebooks. The air smelled of coffee and chalk dust, heavy with expectation. When Samuel stepped in, conversations paused. Some faces showed surprise, others mild annoyance. A few whispered. Harrow gestured to an empty chair near the end of the table. "Mr. Ortiz is joining us today," she said simply. "Let us begin." On the board, a problem had been written in neat strokes of chalk. Twin primes again, but this time in the language of advanced sieve methods, symbols stacked and twisted like vines. Samuel stared, the lines a forest too thick to walk through. One professor, stern and silver-haired, spoke first. "We've tried every angle. The gaps shrink, the methods refine, but the proof remains elusive." He tapped the chalkboard. "It is like chasing shadows." Another added, "Perhaps it is time we stop romanticizing this conjecture. Some doors remain closed." A murmur of agreement circled the table. Then Daniel Lang, the same student who had mocked Samuel in class, leaned forward. His smile was sharp. "Or perhaps we should ask our guest." He looked directly at Samuel. "Mr. Ortiz, do you believe the twin primes walk forever?" A ripple of laughter passed around the table, polite but unmistakable. Professor Harrow's eyes narrowed. "That is enough, Mr. Lang." But Samuel, to his own surprise, spoke. His voice was low, rough, but steady. "I do not know about your sieves or your methods, but I have seen patterns in simpler places. A fence post always leans after the same storm. A light bulb in the north hallway flickers every winter. It is not proof, but it is rhythm. Numbers, I think, keep rhythm too." The room quieted. Some leaned back, skeptical. Others leaned forward, curious. The silver-haired professor asked almost gently, And how would you explain it, Mr. Ortiz, to someone who has never seen these equations? Samuel rose slowly. His knees ached, but his spirit steadied. He walked to the chalkboard. The symbols loomed, a jungle of notation he could not cut through. So he went to the corner of the board, found an empty space, and drew 2 small circles. "These are like 2 workers leaving the factory at midnight," he said. "They walk together, side by side. Then another pair leaves, and another. You do not know how many pairs there will be, but you see enough to wonder if the night has no end." He drew more circles, pairs marching across the board. "Your methods," he gestured to the tangle of equations, "are like maps. But sometimes, to understand the road, you must walk it, slowly, step by step." Silence followed. One graduate student frowned, then whispered, That's actually the essence of the heuristic argument." Another professor chuckled softly. "Heuristic, poetic, it is the same heartbeat." Daniel shifted in his seat, his smile gone. Professor Harrow spoke last. "Thank you, Mr. Ortiz. You have reminded us why we chase these shadows in the first place, not just for the proof, but for the story it tells." The seminar ended quietly. Some students left quickly, unsettled. Others lingered, glancing at Samuel with new eyes. One young man even approached, notebook open. "Mr. Ortiz," he said, hesitant, Would you mind explaining again about the factory workers? I think it helps me see it." Samuel smiled faintly. "It is nothing, just the way I think." That evening, as he wheeled his cart down the corridor, Samuel felt lighter. Not triumphant. He knew he had not solved anything. But for the first time he had spoken in a room of bright minds, and they had listened. Later, standing by the river, he whispered to the memory of Maria, "I walked among them today, not as a ghost, as a man with something to give." The city lights shimmered on the water. Pairs of reflections walked together across the surface, side by side, endless. Word spread quickly through the institute. The janitor who spoke of twin primes like factory workers, who drew pairs of circles on the board and silenced a room, had become the subject of whispers in hallways and side offices. Some told the story with a smile, others with a sneer. But all agreed. The man had stirred something that lectures and papers often failed to reach. By the end of the month, Samuel was invited, though some said summoned, to a larger gathering. Not a quiet seminar this time, but a colloquium in the main lecture hall. Rows of seats, dozens of students, professors scattered among them, notebooks ready, eyes sharp. The kind of room where reputations were built or broken. Samuel nearly refused. He was a janitor. His uniform told the truth of his life. What could he offer in a hall where equations towered higher than his reach? Yet Professor Harrow insisted. "You do not need to solve anything," she said. "Just speak as you did before." So he came. Nervous, shoulders bent, clutching the folded grocery receipt in his pocket like a talisman. The hall buzzed with chatter as he entered. A few students pointed. One muttered loudly enough to hear, "Here comes the philosopher of mops." Laughter rippled. Samuel lowered his eyes and sat quietly in the front row, near Harrow. At the podium stood Dr. Malcolm Dean, a visiting professor from Princeton, known for his sharp critiques. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at Samuel, and began. "Today," Dean said, "we speak of the twin prime conjecture. A question centuries old, still unanswered. Are there infinitely many pairs of primes 2 apart? Our tools have advanced. Our partial results grow sharper. But the proof remains beyond us." He turned, chalk in hand, and filled the board with dense formulas, sieve methods, distribution theorems, error terms. The symbols spread like ivy across the slate. Then, with a sly smile, He paused. Yet some say we may find insight outside these walls, perhaps in unexpected places. His eyes fell on Samuel. Mr. Ortiz, would you share your view with us? The room shifted, students whispering, some grinning. Samuel's hands trembled. He wanted to refuse, to retreat to his mop and his silence. But Maria's voice returned, steady as ever. You were born for chalk. He rose slowly, walked to the board. The dense equations glared down at him like a wall of iron. He could not climb it. So he went to the corner, found an empty space, and picked up the chalk. I cannot follow your methods, he said, his voice quiet but carrying. But I see primes as footsteps, alone, scattered, yet sometimes walking together. 11 and 13, 17 and 19, side by side like two workers leaving the night shift. The question you ask is whether such footsteps continue forever. Laughter flickered in the back rows. But Samuel kept writing. 2 circles, a line, another pair, another. Soon the corner of the board was dotted with companions. He turned to the hall. To me, it is not about solving. It is about seeing. A farmer does not know every storm, but he knows the sky holds more than one. So it is with these pairs. We have seen enough to believe the night has not ended. The hall was silent. Some smirked. Others leaned forward. Dr. Dean crossed his arms. Poetic, Mr. Ortiz. But tell me, what of the gaps that grow wider? What of the long stretches where no twins appear? Do you simply close your eyes and imagine them walking anyway? Samuel met his gaze. His voice steadied. When a worker walks alone for miles, it does not mean his companion does not exist. It only means they have not yet met on the road. Distance does not erase companionship. It only delays it. A murmur swept the room. A graduate student scribbled furiously in his notebook. Another whispered, "That's a clean metaphor for bounded gaps." Dean frowned, but his eyes softened slightly. He had expected the janitor to stumble, to be crushed by ridicule. Instead, Samuel had turned skepticism into a kind of quiet defiance. Professor Harrow rose. Mathematics thrives on rigor, yes, but also on vision. Mr. Ortiz has offered us something too often forgotten, the humanity of numbers. That, too, is worth hearing. Applause began hesitantly, then grew, not thunderous but steady, respectful. Samuel set the chalk down. His knees wobbled as he returned to his seat, but inside him a flame burned bright. He had not solved the twin primes. He had not needed to. He had reminded the room that even numbers had stories, and stories had power. That night, as he walked home along the Charles River, Samuel looked at the reflections of lights dancing in pairs across the water. He whispered, "They walk together, and so do I." The city's silence wrapped around him like a cloak. He was still a janitor. Tomorrow he would mop floors, empty bins, polish glass. But tonight, for a brief moment, he had stood in the circle of chalk and spoken, and the world had listened. The applause from the colloquium lingered in Samuel's ears long after the hall had emptied. It was not thunderous, not the kind that shook rafters, but it had been steady, warm enough to etch itself into memory. For one evening, a janitor had spoken, and the brightest minds had listened. The next morning, Samuel returned to his cart and mop as if nothing had changed. He polished the same brass handles, swept the same corridors, emptied the same bins. Yet the whispers that followed him were no longer just laughter. They carried new tones, curiosity, doubt, even envy. "Did you hear him?" one student muttered as he passed. "He made the whole hall quiet." "Yes," another replied, voice edged with bitterness. But words aren't proofs. He's no mathematician. At the end of the corridor, Daniel Lang leaned against a doorway, arms folded, eyes sharp. "Enjoying your fame, Mr. Ortiz?" he asked, as Samuel wheeled his cart past. Samuel did not answer. He had learned that silence was stronger than most retorts, but inside he felt the sting. Fame? He had never asked for any. He only wanted to see patterns, to give numbers the dignity of companionship. That evening, as he finished mopping room 4149, Professor Harrow appeared again. She carried no books, only a sealed envelope. "This arrived today," she said, handing it to him. Samuel opened it carefully. Inside was a letter on heavy paper, embossed with the seal of the Meridian Foundation, a private institute known for supporting research others considered too unusual. The letter invited him to a meeting. They had heard of his words, they wrote, and believed that sometimes vision came from unexpected voices. Samuel stared at the page, bewildered. "Why me?" he whispered. "Because," Harrow said gently, "you see differently. That alone is rare." He placed the letter back in the envelope, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket beside the old grocery receipt. His heart beat faster, but his voice stayed quiet. "I clean floors. I fix leaks. I am not—" Harrow interrupted. "Do not mistake humility for silence, Mr. Ortiz. One gives light. The other hides it." The next day, Samuel met with representatives of the Foundation. They were polished, precise, their suits pressed, their pens gleaming. They asked him not to solve equations, but to describe how he saw them. "Numbers," Samuel said, hands folded in his lap, "are like workers in a factory. Alone, yes, but sometimes they leave in pairs. We do not know how long the shift is, but we have seen enough pairs to believe the road is long." The representatives exchanged glances. One of them, a woman with silver earrings, leaned forward. "You speak of mathematics as if it were memory. That has value. Would you be willing to sit with some of our researchers? Just conversations. Nothing formal." Samuel hesitated, then nodded. But not everyone welcomed this attention. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at MIT thickened. Some students greeted Samuel with respect, even admiration. A few approached him with questions, eager to hear his metaphors, but others scoffed, their pride bruised. One afternoon, Samuel found a note taped to his cart. "Leave the math to us." The handwriting was jagged, hurried. He removed it without a word and threw it away. Another night, as he entered room 4149, he found the board scrawled not with primes, but with a single sentence written in red chalk. "You are a janitor, not a prophet." He stood before it, the bucket handle tightening in his grip. For a moment, old doubts flooded back. The voice that said he did not belong, that his place was only the mop and the silence. But then he remembered the applause, the students who had leaned forward, the professor who had defended him. He picked up the eraser and wiped the words away. Then, in the corner of the board, he drew two small circles, side by side, with a line between them. He whispered, "Still walking." Yet the hostility was not only from students. Some faculty members, unsettled by the attention Samuel had drawn, spoke in closed-door meetings. "Romantic nonsense," one declared. "We cannot have janitors turning colloquia into poetry readings." Another countered, "But did you not see the room? He stilled it. That is rare." The argument simmered. Some feared ridicule from other universities if word spread too far. Others sensed a possibility, a new way of teaching, of reaching minds. Samuel knew none of this directly. He only felt the tension in glances, in whispers, in the way doors sometimes closed as he approached. Still, he continued his work. He cleaned, He mopped. He polished. But each night, when the halls were empty, he returned to the board. There, in chalk, he drew circles and lines, pairs marching across the slate. He did not call it research. He called it remembering. One evening, as he stood back from the board, Professor Harrow entered quietly. She studied the drawings, then looked at him. "They are watching you," she said, "some with kindness, some with knives. Are you ready for both?" Samuel sighed. His shoulders sagged, but his eyes held steady. "I have been doubted all my life, Professor. It does not frighten me now." She nodded. "Then walk carefully. The brighter the light, the sharper the shadow." That night, Samuel crossed the Charles River under a sky scattered with stars. Each star alone, yet many twinkled in pairs, side by side across the dark. He stopped halfway, leaned on the railing, and smiled faintly. "They walk together," he whispered, "and so will I." The wind carried his words across the water. Somewhere, unseen, the twin primes marched on. Perhaps endless, perhaps not. But for Samuel, the journey had already proven infinite. The corridors of MIT were never truly dark. Even after midnight, strips of fluorescent light hummed above the tiled floors, soft and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Samuel had walked those halls for 2 decades, mop in hand, never imagining that one night he would not be alone. It began quietly. A week after the cruel message scrawled in red chalk, Samuel unlocked room 4149 to clean, only to find someone already inside. A young woman sat at the back, notebooks open, eyes tired but bright. She looked up as he entered. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I just needed a place to think." Samuel nodded. "This room is always open after midnight." He set down his bucket, began to sweep. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you really see primes like workers? Like companions?" Samuel stopped, leaning on the broom handle. "I see them as footsteps, sometimes far apart, sometimes side by side. Like life." Her eyes softened. "That helps me more than any textbook." She closed her notebook, gathered her things, then paused. "My name is Aisha. I'll come back, if that's all right." The next night she returned, this time with another student, a boy named Ravi, who carried more doubts than answers. The night after that, 2 more came, one with sketchbooks full of diagrams, another with nothing but a hunger to understand. Soon, room 4149 was no longer Samuel's silent refuge. It was a circle, small, fragile, but alive. They gathered after midnight, when lectures had ended and professors had gone home. Samuel would draw circles on the board, pairs of primes stepping like companions through the dark. The students, weary from the day's rigor, leaned into his metaphors as if drinking water after a long thirst. "This is not a class," Samuel told them. "There are no grades here, no ranks. Only questions, only walking together." And so they walked. One night Aisha asked, "Why do the gaps between primes grow so wide? Sometimes there is a desert before you find the next pair." Samuel smiled faintly. "Have you walked in winter snow? Sometimes footsteps vanish under wind, and you think you are alone. But if you keep going, you find another set ahead, waiting. Gaps are not endings. They are pauses." Ravi added quietly, "So, the conjecture is like believing the road never stops?" "Yes," Samuel said. "Like believing morning will always come, even when the night feels endless." The students wrote notes, but not like in lectures. They wrote as if recording stories, fragments of wisdom that mathematics had hidden in plain sight. Word spread, though not loudly. Whispers moved through dormitories. There's a janitor who teaches without teaching, who talks about numbers as if they breathe. Some scoffed, some laughed, but others came, slipping into the room after midnight, curious to see for themselves. One evening, Samuel entered to find half a dozen students waiting already. They had pulled the desks into a circle. Chalk waited on the ledge. Aisha smiled. "We saved you a seat." Samuel hesitated, then sat. For the first time in years, he was not standing with a mop or eraser in hand. He was part of a circle. That night, they did not speak of sieves or error terms. They spoke of companionship, of how numbers, like people, longed for connection, of how proofs, like journeys, were not always about reaching the end, but about walking the path. "Why do you come here?" Samuel asked them softly. A boy named Thomas shrugged. "Because during the day, math feels like war, competing, racing, proving. But here, it feels like music." Samuel nodded. "Music lasts longer than battles." From then on, they called it the Midnight Math Circle. Not official, not sanctioned, but theirs. They brought thermoses of tea, packets of biscuits, even a guitar one night. Between equations and metaphors, laughter bloomed. They argued sometimes, but gently, like siblings testing each other's patience. Samuel rarely lectured. He asked questions, offered images, and always he drew pairs of circles, reminding them that even the loneliest numbers might have a companion waiting. But shadows still lingered. Some students mocked the circle, calling it a bedtime story for the weak. A note appeared once on the board: "Dreams are not proofs." Samuel erased it calmly, then wrote beneath, "Proofs are not the only dreams worth chasing." The circle cheered quietly. Professor Harrow visited once, slipping into the back unnoticed. She listened as Samuel spoke of primes like lanterns in a long tunnel, each one lighting the next. She saw the students leaning forward, eyes soft, notebooks forgotten. When she left, she whispered to herself, "This is what math was meant to be." The circle grew, not large, never loud, but steady. Students who struggled in lectures found courage there. Those who excelled but felt empty found meaning. And Samuel, once invisible in the corridors, found something he had not dared to imagine: belonging. One night, after the others had gone, Aisha lingered. She looked at the chalkboard covered in pairs. "Mr. Ortiz," she said, "why do you keep drawing them, over and over?" Samuel smiled, weary but warm. "Because when I draw them, I remember Maria. We walked together once, side by side. And though she is gone, I believe the road continues." Aisha's eyes glistened. "Then maybe that's what the twin primes mean. That nothing walks alone forever." Samuel nodded. "Yes, that is why we keep searching." That night, as he walked home along the Charles River, the water shimmered with twin reflections of streetlights. He stopped on the bridge, leaned against the railing, and whispered, "They walk together, and so do we." The wind carried his words across the dark water. Behind him, in a small classroom at MIT, chalk dust lingered in the air like the echo of a hymn. The Midnight Math Circle had begun, and once begun, it would not end easily. The Midnight Math Circle had grown quietly, like ivy on an old wall, soft, patient, unnoticed at first. A handful of students became a dozen became 20. By the end of the term, the circle met not only in room 4 to 149, but in the hall outside, where students sat cross-legged on the floor, notebooks balanced on their knees. They gathered for warmth as much as for wisdom. Samuel rarely taught in the traditional sense. Instead, he asked questions, drew pairs of circles, and spoke of rhythms hidden beneath the noise of numbers. His metaphors, footsteps in snow, lanterns in tunnels, workers walking home, settled into their minds like seeds in good soil. But secrets rarely remain secret at MIT. One night, a student recorded a fragment of Samuel's words on her phone. She posted it online, where it spread faster than chalk dust in sunlight. The clip was short. Samuel, gray hair catching the light, standing at the board, his voice steady. Proofs may tell us if something is true, but metaphors remind us why it matters. The twin primes are not only numbers, they are companionship, walking together through infinity. The video was watched thousands of times. Some viewers wept, others scoffed, and within days, the whispers in MIT's corridors became arguments. He makes math human, one student said. I've never understood primes until now. He's dangerous, another countered. He confuses poetry with proof. This isn't teaching, it's theater. Professors debated in faculty lounges. Some defended him. He reaches where we cannot. Our students are listening again. Others bristled. We are a university, not a chapel. If janitors deliver sermons instead of scholars delivering rigor, we undermine ourselves. And always in the middle was Samuel. He felt the change in the way doors closed when he passed, in the way conversations stopped when he entered. Letters began to arrive. Some slipped under his door at night. One read, "You gave me hope to keep studying. Thank you." Another, "Stay in your place, old man. You shame the rest of us." Samuel kept them all, hope in one pocket, shame in the other, walking with both. The foundation noticed, too. Representatives from Meridian returned, this time with sharper smiles. You have an audience now, they told him. We can help you reach further. A book, perhaps. Lectures. Funding for your circle. Samuel shook his head gently. The circle is not mine. It belongs to the night, to the students who need it. Money cannot buy its silence, and lights too bright will scatter it. They pressed him. He remained firm. But pressure grew elsewhere. One morning, Samuel arrived to find room 4149 locked. A notice taped to the door. Facility under review. Unauthorized gatherings prohibited. Students clustered outside, murmuring anger in their eyes. Why would they close it? Aisha asked. Because they fear what they do not control, Samuel said softly. That night, the circle met in the hallway instead. Desks dragged into rows, chalk drawn directly onto tile. Samuel knelt on the floor, his knees aching, and drew circles as he always had. The students leaned close, hungry for the rhythm. But the storm only thickened. At the next faculty meeting, Samuel's name filled the agenda. Some argued for his dismissal. We cannot legitimize superstition, one said. Others argued for protection. He heals more wounds than we measure. Professor Harrow defended him fiercely. You speak of rigor, but what good is rigor if our students lose heart? He has reminded them of the wonder in mathematics. That is no small gift. The room divided. No decision reached. But Samuel felt the weight of the storm pressing closer. That evening, Daniel Lang confronted him in the corridor, his voice sharp, his jaw tight. You think you're helping them, Daniel said, but you're not. You're making them weak. Math is war. It is not bedtime stories. Samuel studied him with quiet eyes. War burns quickly. Stories last longer. Daniel scoffed, turned away, but his fists clenched. Later, as Samuel crossed the bridge over the Charles, he stopped to watch the water. Reflections danced in pairs as always. He pulled the old grocery receipt from his pocket, unfolded it gently. The ink had faded, but the rhythm remained, pairs of numbers, marching still. He whispered to Maria, The storm is coming, but storms pass, and the circle will remain. The wind carried his words across the river. Behind him, in hidden corners of MIT, students still gathered. Not in one room now, but in many. The Midnight Math Circle had grown roots deeper than locks or notices could reach. It had become more than a meeting. It had become a movement. And once begun, movements are hard to erase. The notice arrived pinned to the bulletin board outside the cafeteria, where hundreds of eyes could not miss it. Special colloquium on rigor and romance in mathematics. Attendance required for graduate students. At the bottom, in smaller letters, guest speaker, Samuel Ortiz. By noon, the campus buzzed like a hive. Some laughed. They're putting the janitor on trial. Others whispered with sympathy. Why humiliate him? He only speaks with kindness. Professors argued in hallways. Some sharpened their questions. Others worried what damage the spectacle might bring. Samuel read the notice quietly. He did not protest. For 2 nights, he slept little, sitting by his window, the grocery receipt in his hands. He thought of Maria, of her faith in him long ago, of her words. You were born for chalk. The day came. Jefferson Auditorium, tall columns and high windows filled to the edges. Students crammed into rows, notebooks ready more for gossip than equations. Professors sat in clusters, expressions stern. At the center table sat Dr. Malcolm Dean from Princeton. Daniel Lang beside him, and 2 other faculty members who had grown tired of whispers about janitors and circles. At the far end, Professor Harrow sat, her hands folded, her gaze steady. When Samuel entered, a hush fell. He wore his plain uniform, freshly pressed, shoes polished until they shone under the lights. He carried nothing in his hands but the faded receipt tucked in his pocket. Dean rose first. We gather today, he said, voice loud enough to reach the rafters, to examine what has stirred our halls. Is mathematics to be shaped by rigor alone, or can metaphor claim equal ground? Mr. Ortiz, you have captured attention. But attention is not proof. Tonight you will explain yourself. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Samuel stepped forward slowly, stood at the lectern. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but clear. I am not a mathematician. I am a janitor. I mop your floors. I polish your glass. But in the dust of chalk, I have seen patterns. And patterns, like footsteps, ask to be remembered. Dean interjected, sharp. Then answer this. Can you give us a single equation, a single formal line that proves the infinity of twin primes? Samuel shook his head gently. No. Laughter burst from the back rows. Daniel smiled, victory flashing in his eyes, but Samuel raised his hand, asking for silence. I cannot give you proof, but I can give you vision. He turned to the chalkboard. With slow strokes, he drew a long road, stretching across the slate. Along the road he placed small dots, primes. Some alone, scattered. Others paired, side by side. This, he said, is the journey of numbers. You see the gaps. They grow wide, yes. You see the loneliness. But you also see the pairs. Again and again, they appear. The question you ask is whether the pairs continue forever. I do not know, but I know this. When I walk home across the bridge each night, the lights in the water shine in pairs. And I believe the river does not end where my eyes stop seeing it. Silence gripped the hall. Even laughter froze. Dean frowned. Belief is not mathematics. No, Samuel replied softly. But mathematics is not without belief. Every conjecture begins with faith that a pattern we glimpse may hold beyond our reach. Proof may confirm it, or deny it. But faith begins the journey. A professor at the back whispered, "That is the essence of conjecture." Daniel rose suddenly, his voice sharp. "So what are you then? A preacher? A poet? This is not a chapel. This is MIT. We demand rigor." Samuel met his gaze calmly. "And what is rigor without wonder? A body without breath. You may build walls of proof, but without wonder, no one will walk through them." The words fell heavy. Students shifted in their seats. Some stared at Samuel with awe, others with unease. Professor Harrow finally stood. "We test our students on knowledge, but perhaps we should test ourselves on humility. Mr. Ortiz has given us neither theorem nor solution. He has given us something rarer, remembrance that mathematics is human, that it belongs not only to those with titles, but to all who can see its patterns." For a moment, the hall held stillness like a cathedral. Then slowly, applause began. Hesitant at first, then growing, wave after wave. Not all clapped. Some sat rigid, arms crossed. But the sound swelled until it filled the high windows, until it washed over Samuel like light. He bowed his head, not in triumph, but in gratitude. That night, crossing the bridge, he stopped once more to watch the reflections. They stretched across the water in endless pairs, twin lights walking together into the dark. He whispered, "Proof may belong to others, but wonder walks with me." The Charles River carried his words away, and above him, the stars seemed to lean closer, shining not alone, but side by side. Spring came to Cambridge, soft and green along the Charles. The air carried the smell of thawed earth and new beginnings. Yet inside MIT, tension lingered like the last frost. Samuel still mopped the corridors, still polished the glass doors, but he felt the air pressing heavier each day. The midnight math circle had not died when room 449 was locked. It had only scattered, taking root in lounges, libraries, even the steps outside. Students still gathered around him, hungry for the quiet metaphors that gave numbers life. But Samuel knew storms cannot rage forever. He had been through enough winters to recognize the signs of change. One evening, Professor Harrow found him sitting alone in an empty classroom, chalk in hand, a row of twin circles stretching across the board. "They will not leave you in peace," she said gently. "Half the faculty want to crown you as an emblem of wonder. The other half want to erase you before the world laughs at us. And you stand in between." Samuel set the chalk down. His hands were rough, scarred from years of buckets and soap, but steady. "I did not come here to fight. I came to work. And somehow, work led me to this board." Harrow sat beside him. "What will you do?" Samuel looked at the circles, then at the window where evening light spilled across the desks. "I will open a door of my own. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere no one can lock." Within a month, Samuel left MIT. He turned in his keys, folded his uniform neatly, and thanked the men and women who had walked the night shifts beside him. Some wept, some shook his hand in silence. The students of the Midnight Math Circle gathered one last time by the Charles River. They gave him a piece of slate, small enough to carry, etched with two circles side by side. "So you never forget us," Aisha whispered. "I could not forget," Samuel replied. "You are the proof that mattered." He returned to the outskirts of Boston, to a modest neighborhood where families worked long hours and children carried heavy burdens. In a disused church basement, with cracked walls and wooden benches, Samuel began again. He swept the floor, set up a chalkboard salvaged from a school auction, and opened the door at dusk. The first night, only 3 children came, 2 brothers and a girl with paint-stained fingers. Samuel drew circles on the board, told them of numbers that walked in pairs, of footsteps in snow, of lanterns in tunnels. They listened, wide-eyed, and as if he had lifted the stars down into their hands. Word spread. Soon more children arrived, then teenagers, then weary workers curious to sit and listen after their shifts. They called it the Midnight Math Circle, just as the students at MIT had. But here, it belonged to everyone. No tuition, no ranks, no titles, only chalk, questions, and wonder. Samuel never claimed to prove anything, but his metaphors carried further than equations. A janitor's wisdom became a lantern in a neighborhood that had known too much dark. Years passed. His hair turned silver, his steps slower. But every night, he drew circles on the board, always in pairs, always side by side. At MIT, stories of him lingered like echoes. Some faculty dismissed them as folklore. Others spoke softly of the janitor who once silenced a hall with a metaphor. In time, a plaque appeared outside room 4 to 149. It bore no grand title, only a sentence. Genius is not how loud you speak, but how clearly you help others think. Students touched the plaque before exams, as if it carried luck. Professors paused to read it, some smiling, some humbled. And in the church basement, chalk dust rose each night like incense. Children grew into adults, carrying Samuel's words into their own lives. A nurse used his metaphors to explain healing. A mechanic used them to teach apprentices. A young boy who once drew circles became a teacher himself, opening circles of his own. One evening, near the end of his life, Samuel sat by the chalkboard alone. The room was quiet, the benches empty. He picked up the old grocery receipt, edges frayed, ink faded but still legible. 11 and 13, 17 and 19. His first pairs, his first whisper of infinity. He placed the receipt on the desk, lifted the chalk one last time, and drew 2 circles side by side. Then he whispered, "Maria, we are still walking." The circle was never erased. When Samuel passed, the community gathered in the basement, candles flickering, chalk still clinging to the board. They spoke of him not as a janitor, not even as a mathematician, but as a companion who had shown them that numbers could heal as well as prove. And somewhere, across the Charles River, lights reflected on the water in endless pairs, walking together into the dark, as if to carry his story further than any proof could reach. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this story. If Samuel's circles left you with even a little warmth, a little faith, consider subscribing to the channel, not for fame, but so that stories of quiet genius and kindness may keep burning. I'll be waiting for you in the next circle.